A millionaire is startled by the sound of his mansion's doorbell on a rainy afternoon. Upon opening the door, he finds a 6-year-old girl wearing a worn and wet cleaning uniform. With a trembling but firm voice, she whispers, "Sir, I came in place of my mother. She's very sick and there's no one else to take care of me." At that moment, he recognizes the daughter of the cleaner he was about to fire for 2 consecutive weeks of absences. When he discovers the truth behind those absences and what the little girl was doing to protect her mother's job, his life changes forever. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the mansion like a scream lost in the vastness of cold marble. Edward Sterling paused halfway up the staircase, his fingers gripping the mahogany banister with enough force to turn his knuckles white. That sound had no place on a rainy Tuesday at 3 in the afternoon. No one dared visit him without a prior appointment, and certainly not on a day like this, when raindrops beat against the windows like desperate tears. At 52, Edward had built an empire on absolute control and predictability. Every minute of his life was meticulously planned. Every meeting scheduled weeks in advance, every decision made with the calculated coldness that had made him one of the wealthiest men in the country. His mansion, with its 40 rooms and impeccable gardens, was the perfect reflection of his personality, imposing, untouchable, and completely isolated from the outside world. The bell rang again, more insistent this time. Edward descended the steps slowly, each footfall echoing in the grand foyer like a pronouncement of doom. His blue eyes, normally as cold as ice, showed a flicker of growing irritation. Who would dare disturb his sacred routine? Perhaps a lost salesman or a delivery driver with the wrong address. Whatever the reason, he would deal with it swiftly and return to his study, where stacks of documents awaited his signature. The smell of rain invaded the mansion as Edward pulled open the heavy oak door. The cold wind touched his face, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and fallen leaves. He was prepared to dismiss any unwanted visitor with his usual frostiness, but the words died in his throat when his eyes fell upon the sight before him. A small girl, no older than 6, stood on the doorstep. Her worn-out blue smock was soaked and tattered, clinging to her thin frame like a second skin. Her brown hair, drenched by the rain, was plastered to her pale face, but it was her eyes that made Edward's heart stop. Large, dark, and filled with a determination that starkly contrasted with the fear that also lived there, as if an adult soul were trapped in a fragile child's body. The girl clutched a transparent plastic bag against her chest, protecting something Edward couldn't identify. Her small hands trembled, but not just from the cold. There was something deeper in that tremor, a vulnerability that touched a part of Edward he thought had died long ago. "Sir," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound that cut through the air like a sharp blade. The word came out shaky, but there was a firmness behind it that surprised Edward. "I'm here for my mom." Edward felt the world tilt slightly around him. His rational mind scrambled to process the information, but something more primal, more human, was stirring in his chest. He knew those eyes. Not personally, but he had seen their reflection every day for 2 weeks. The reflection of the same determination and despair in the face of the woman who cleaned his house. "She's very sick, and there's no one else to take care of me," the girl continued, and her words were like small daggers piercing the defenses Edward had carefully built over decades. The rain continued to fall, creating a liquid curtain around the pair. Edward could feel the water running down his face, mixing with something he hadn't felt in years: tears. This child, wet and trembling, had accomplished in seconds what no business rival had managed in decades, rendering him completely speechless. At that moment, standing on the threshold of his mansion, Edward Sterling had no idea that his life had just changed forever. The girl shivering before him wasn't just the daughter of the cleaning lady he was about to fire. She was the key. to a transformation he didn't even know he needed. Edward remained motionless for long seconds, studying the girl's face as if it were a complex document he needed to decipher. The rain continued to fall, but he barely noticed the water soaking his expensive Italian shoes. His mind, trained for quick and precise decisions, was completely paralyzed by this unprecedented situation. "Come in," he finally said, his voice rougher than usual. He stepped back, making room for the girl to pass. She hesitated for a moment, as if assessing whether she could trust him before crossing the threshold with small, cautious steps. The contrast was shocking. The girl, with her drenched smock and worn-out shoes, seemed even smaller in the mansion's grand foyer. The white marble beneath her feet, the crystal chandeliers above her head, the priceless paintings on the walls, all conspired to highlight her vulnerability. Edward closed the door, and the sound echoed through the house like distant thunder. "What's your name?" Edward asked, his voice taking on the formal tone he used in business meetings. It was his way of keeping a distance, of not getting emotionally involved. "Sophia," she answered, wiping her nose with a wet sleeve. "Sophia Garcia. My mom is Carmen." "Carmen Garcia." Edward mentally sifted through his employee files. 43 years old, widowed, had worked at the mansion for 8 months. Always punctual, efficient, almost invisible. Until 2 weeks ago, when she started missing work without explanation. He had decided to fire her the following Friday. "Where is your mother now?" Edward asked, guiding Sophia into the living room. He didn't know why he was doing this. His natural inclination would be to call social services and resolve the problem practically and distantly. Sophia shrank into the velvet sofa, looking even smaller against the enormous cushions. "At St. Luke's Hospital. She's been there for 2 weeks, but she made me promise not to tell anyone." Her words tumbled out as if she were fighting the urge to cry. 2 weeks? Edward felt a knot form in his stomach. "And you've been alone all this time?" Sophia nodded, biting her lower lip. "Mum said if you found out, you'd fire her. She really needs the job, sir. We don't have anyone else since my dad left." Edward sat in the armchair opposite her, his hands clasped so tightly the knuckles turned white. The reality of the situation was beginning to penetrate his rational defenses. While he was considering firing Carmen for unexcused absences, a 6-year-old child was fending for herself, protecting her sick mother's job. "What have you been eating?" The question slipped out before he could stop himself. There was something about Sophia's thinness that deeply unsettled him. "Bread and water," she answered simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Sometimes there are crackers the neighbors give us, but the money Mom left is running out." Edward felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. His entire life was based on numbers, profits, efficiency. He had never stopped to think about what happened to the people behind the names on his payroll. Carmen Garcia wasn't just an employee who missed work. She was a desperate mother trying to protect her child while battling an illness. "Sophia," he said, his voice softer this time. "Tell me about your mother. When did she get sick?" Sophia's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back quickly, as if she had learned not to cry. She'd been coughing for a long time, but she said it was just from being tired. Then one night, she fainted in the kitchen and there was blood coming from her mouth. The neighbors called an ambulance. Edward closed his eyes for a moment, trying to process the information. Carmen had been ill and continued to work for fear of losing her job. How many mornings had she cleaned his house while fighting through pain? How many times had he passed her in the hallways without really seeing her? "And you came here all by yourself?" Edward asked, impressed by the girl's courage. Sophia nodded, clutching the plastic bag to her chest. "I took 3 buses. I asked a lot of people until I found the house. Mum always said you were a good man, that you take care of your employees." Those words struck Edward like a bolt of lightning. Carmen had spoken well of him to her daughter, even knowing he was about to fire her. The woman's faith in his kindness was a weight he didn't know how to bear. The rain continued to beat against the windows, but inside the mansion, something had irrevocably changed. Edward looked at Sophia, still shivering on the sofa, and realized his life had just become complicated in a way he could never have predicted. "Sophia," he said, rising slowly, "you're not going home alone tonight." Edward asked Mrs. Albright, his housekeeper, to prepare a room for Sophia and find her some dry clothes. While the girl took a warm bath, he locked himself in his study, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to destroy the composure he had so carefully built over decades. His hands trembled as he leafed through Carmen Garcia's file. The information was sparse: address, phone number, references from previous jobs, nothing about her personal life, her struggles, her fears. To Edward, she'd always been just another name on the payroll, a silent presence that kept his house immaculate. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Sophia entered hesitantly, now wearing a fluffy bathrobe that completely swallowed her. Her clean, dry hair framed a face that seemed even younger and more vulnerable. "Sir," she said, her small voice echoing in the study filled with books and business trophies. "Can I show you something?" Edward nodded, watching as Sophia opened the plastic bag she had carried all afternoon. From inside, she carefully removed a series of crumpled papers and a small cleaning cloth. "I tried to help Mommy," Sophia explained, holding the papers out to Edward. "I drew a map of the house so I wouldn't forget where to clean everything." Edward took the papers with trembling hands. They were childish drawings, but surprisingly detailed. Sophia had mapped out every room in the mansion, noting in her uncertain handwriting where the furniture that needed dusting was, which products to use on each surface. There were even small arrows indicating the correct direction to vacuum. "I came here early, in the morning before you woke up," Sophia continued, her voice gaining confidence. "I cleaned the dining room and the foyer just like Mommy did. I didn't want you to be angry with her for not being able to come to work." Edward felt the air leave his lungs. For 2 weeks, while he had been stewing over Carmen's incompetence and lack of commitment, her 6-year-old daughter had been waking up before dawn, taking buses alone, and desperately trying to save her mother's job. The courage and dedication of this child were both inspiring and devastating. "Sophia," he said, his voice hoarser than usual, "you didn't have to do that. It wasn't your responsibility." "But I wanted to help," she replied, her large eyes shining with unshed tears. "Mommy always says that work is serious, that you can't let people down. I didn't want you to think she was bad." Edward stood up abruptly, walking to the window. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still heavy with dark clouds. He rested his forehead against the cold glass, trying to organize the thoughts that crashed in his mind like furious waves. His entire life had been built on the premise that people were resources to be managed, numbers to be optimized. Efficiency was everything. Results were everything. He had never stopped to think about the stories behind the names on his payroll, the silent struggles that took place far from his sight. "Sir," Sophia's voice brought him back to the present. She had come closer and was now standing beside him, looking out the window. "Are you going to fire Mommy when she gets better?" The question was like a slap in the face. Edward turned to look at Sophia, seeing not just a child, but a reflection of his own abandoned childhood. He too had been left behind, but by choice, not by necessity. He had built walls so high around his heart that he had forgotten what it felt like to have genuine compassion. "No," he said, and for the first time in years, his voice carried real emotion. "I'm not going to fire your mother. Ever." Sophia smiled, a smile so pure and radiant that Edward felt something break inside his chest. It was as if decades of ice were melting all at once, leaving him vulnerable and frightened. "Do you want to see my mom?" Sophia asked, pulling an old cell phone from the pocket of her robe. "I have a picture of her." Edward nodded, taking the device carefully. The photo showed Carmen smiling, hugging Sophia in a small apartment. They both looked happy, despite the simplicity of their surroundings. Edward recognized Carmen's eyes, the same determined eyes he saw in Sophia. "She's very beautiful," he said, and it was true. Carmen had a warm smile that lit up her tired face. "She's going to get better, right, sir?" Sophia asked, her small voice filled with hope and fear. Edward looked at the brave child who had walked through the rain to protect her mother, who had tried to clean an entire mansion to keep a job, who had sacrificed her own childhood to care for a broken family. And for the first time in decades, Edward Sterling felt his heart open completely. "We're going to do everything in our power to make sure she gets better," he promised, and he knew that promise would change everything. The next morning brought a timid sun that filtered through the silk curtains of the guest room. Edward had spent a sleepless night pacing the mansion's corridors, trying to understand how his orderly life had devolved into an emotional whirlwind in a matter of hours. When he came down for breakfast, he found Sophia sitting at the kitchen table, slowly eating a slice of bread with jam. "Good morning, sir," she said, her eyes still puffy from sleep, but carrying that same determination that had impressed him the day before. "Good morning, Sophia," Edward replied, sitting across from her. Mrs. Albright had prepared a full breakfast: eggs, fruit, juices, various breads, but Sophia was eating only a single slice, chewing each bite as if it were precious. "Don't you like eggs?" Edward asked, noticing the untouched plate in front of her. Sophia looked at him with an expression that mixed shame and fear. "Mommy always said not to ask for expensive food when we're at other people's houses. Bread is enough." Those words struck Edward like a direct hit. Even here, in his home, being offered hospitality, Sophia still felt like an intruder who didn't deserve more than the basics. The upbringing Carmen had given her daughter reflected a lifetime of hardship and a painful awareness of her social standing. "Sophia," Edward said, his voice firm but gentle, "here, you can eat. Whatever you want, this is your home now for as long as you need." Sophia's eyes filled with tears. "Do you promise you won't change? Your mind, other people have said that before, but then what?" Edward leaned forward, sensing he was about to learn something important. Sophia looked down, playing with the crumbs on her plate. "When Mommy got sick the first time, last year, she couldn't work for a week. The family she worked for before said we could stay at their house until she got better." Edward felt a knot form in his stomach. What happened? On the third day, they found out Mom would need expensive medicine and that she might get sick again. Then they told us we had to leave because they didn't want any trouble. Sophia wiped away an escaped tear. "The lady of the house said a sick mother is no good for work and a fatherless child is just trouble." Edward felt a dull rage rise in his chest. The casual cruelty of those people, the way they had discarded Carmen and Sophia as if they were disposable objects, awakened him to a reality he had always ignored. How many families went through similar situations? How many stories of suffering had he overlooked in his results-focused life? "After that, we had to move 3 times, Sophia continued, her voice tiny but steady. "Always the same thing. At first people are nice, but when they find out Mom gets sick sometimes they make up excuses to send us away." Edward stood abruptly, walking to the kitchen window. The mansion's garden stretched out before him, perfectly manicured, a symbol of order and control. But inside the house, his life was being turned upside down by a 6-year-old girl who had experienced more rejection and cruelty than many adults. "Sophia," he said, turning to her, "answer me one thing honestly. Are you afraid I'll do the same thing?" Sophia nodded slowly, biting her lower lip. "Everyone always does." "Sir!" "Mum says it's because we're poor and sick, and rich people don't like problems." The brutal simplicity of Sophia's answer cut Edward like a blade. She had learned, at 6 years old, that her life and her mother's life were seen as inconveniences to be discarded. The matter-of-fact way she accepted this reality was both stunning and devastating. Edward returned to the table and knelt before Sophia, bringing himself to her eye level. "Sophia, listen to me very carefully. I am not like those other people. When I promise something, I keep it, and I promise that you and your mother will always have a place here." "Even if she gets sick again?" Sophia asked, her voice laden with a fragile hope. "Especially if she gets sick again," Edward replied, surprising himself with the conviction in his own voice. Sophia looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to read his soul. Then, slowly, she reached out her small hand and touched Edward's face. "You have sad eyes, sir," she said, "just like mine when Daddy left." Edward closed his eyes, feeling the soft touch of Sophia's hand on his face. In that moment, he realized he wasn't just saving Sophia and Carmen. They were also saving something in him that had been lost long ago, his ability to feel, to care, to be human. "Maybe," he murmured, "we all need each other more than we realize." Sophia smiled, and for the first time since she arrived, she seemed to truly believe that maybe, finally, she had found a place where she could stay. Edward parked his black Mercedes at the entrance of St. Luke's Hospital, a modest building that stood in stark contrast to the private hospitals where he usually had his annual checkups. Sophia was beside him, clutching a cloth doll that Mrs. Albright had found in the mansion's attic. It was an old doll, but Sophia hugged it as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. "Mummy will be happy to see you," Sophia said, but Edward could hear the anxiety in her voice. "She doesn't know I came to your house. I think she's going to be mad at me." Edward stopped the car and turned to Sophia. "Why would she be mad?" "Because I disobeyed," Sophia explained, her large eyes reflecting guilt. "She told me not to bother anyone, to wait for her to come back. But it's been 2 weeks, and she's not back." Edward felt a sharp pain in his chest. Sophia had made an impossible choice for a 6-year-old, disobey her mother to potentially save her. The courage required to make that choice was overwhelming. They walked through the hospital corridors, Edward feeling out of place amidst the simple, functional environment. He was used to marble clinics and luxurious offices. Here, the walls were painted a pale green, the floor was worn linoleum, and the smell of disinfectant mixed with human suffering was almost tangible. Sophia led him through the halls with the familiarity of someone who had made the journey many times. "It's here," she said, stopping before a slightly ajar door. Edward peeked through the gap and saw Carmen for the first time in 2 weeks. The shock was immediate. The woman who cleaned his house with quiet efficiency was unrecognizable, thin, pale, connected to tubes and monitors. Carmen looked as fragile as broken porcelain. "Mommy," Sophia called softly, pushing the door open. Carmen's eyes fluttered open, and when she saw Sophia, her face lit up with a smile that defied her physical condition. "My love, you came." Then her eyes moved to Edward, and her expression instantly shifted to panic. "Mr. Sterling." She tried to sit up, but the tubes held her back. "Sophia, what did you do? I told you not to." "Easy, Carmen," Edward said, approaching. "The bed. Sophia did the right thing. She's very brave. Carmen began to cry, tears of shame and despair rolling down her pale face. Sir, I'm so sorry. I wanted to work, but I couldn't. I tried to hide it, tried not to miss, but... Carmen, Edward interrupted, his voice gentler than he had ever used with any employee. Why didn't you tell me you were sick? Carmen looked at Sophia, then back at Edward. Because I needed the job. You're a busy, important man. You don't have time for a maid's problems. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand. I thought if I could just hold on a little longer, if I got better soon. Edward felt as if 100-pound weight had been placed on his chest. Carmen had suffered in silence, sacrificing her health for fear of losing her job, and he, in his ivory tower, had interpreted her absence as negligence. What kind of illness do you have, Carmen? Edward asked, pulling a chair closer to the bed. The doctors say it's tuberculosis, Carmen replied, her voice weak. It's in an advanced state because I didn't seek treatment sooner. I was afraid of missing work, of losing the money. Sophia climbed onto the bed and nestled beside her mother, careful not to disturb the tubes. Mommy, Mr. Edward said you're not going to lose your job. He promised. Carmen looked at Edward in disbelief. Sir, you don't have to do this. I understand if you want to let me go. A sick employee is no good to anyone. Carmen, Edward said, leaning forward. You've served my household for 8 months. You cared for my home as if it were your own, and your daughter. He glanced at Sophia. Your daughter has taught me more about courage and loyalty in 2 days than I've learned in 52 years of life. Carmen frowned, confused. I don't understand, sir. Edward told her about Sophia's visit, about the maps she had drawn, about how she had tried to clean the mansion by herself. With every word, Carmen's expression shifted between pride and horror as she realized what her daughter had faced. She did that alone, Carmen whispered, hugging Sophia to her chest. For 2 weeks, Edward confirmed. Carmen, your daughter is 6 years old and has more sense of responsibility than many adults I know. Carmen began to cry again, but now they were tears of relief and gratitude. Sophia, my love, you didn't have to... Yes, I did, Mommy, Sophia said, looking into her mother's eyes. You always took care of me. Now it's my turn to take care of you. Edward watched the exchange between mother and daughter, feeling something profound shift in his chest. Here was love in its purest form, sacrificial, unconditional, brave. It was something his life of luxury and power had never afforded him. Carmen, he said, I want you to focus only on getting well. Sophia will stay with me until you recover. And when you come back, it will be as supervisor of the cleaning staff with a proper salary and a full health plan. Carmen looked at him as if she were witnessing a miracle. Sir, I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to, Edward replied. It's the least I can do. But as he left the hospital that afternoon, Edward knew he wasn't just doing it out of kindness. He was doing it because Sophia and Carmen had awakened something in him he thought was long dead, the capacity for unconditional love. In the second week since Sophia's arrival, Edward began to notice subtle changes in his staff's behavior. Sidelong glances, conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered a room, a tense atmosphere that hung in the air like a thick fog. For years, he had maintained a professional distance from his team, but now, with Sophia running through the halls and filling the house with childish laughter, that dynamic was drastically changing. The first direct manifestation of hostility came from Ben, the groundskeeper who had worked on the property for 15 years. Edward found him in the study that morning, a scowl on his face, his nervous hands twisting a worn-out baseball cap. Mr. Sterling, Ben began, his voice thick with discomfort. I need to talk to you about this situation. Edward looked up from the documents he was reviewing. What situation, Ben? This girl who's living here, Ben said, avoiding eye contact. The staff is talking. It ain't right, sir. A single man, a kid with no family around. Edward felt his blood run hot. What are you insinuating exactly? Ben shifted uncomfortably. I'm not insinuating anything, sir. But people talk. The neighbors, the other staff, they think it's strange. And the girl, sir, she's a maid's daughter. She shouldn't be mixed up in our lives. Our lives? Edward rose slowly, his voice dangerously low. Sophia is a child who needs protection. Her mother has worked for me for almost a year. Works when she's not sick, Ben muttered, just loud enough for Edward to hear. What did you say? Ben took a deep breath as if gathering courage. Sir, with all due respect, Carmen has always been trouble. Always making up excuses to be absent. And now you're letting a kid manipulate you. Edward rounded the desk, stopping in front of Ben. His imposing presence made the man take a step back. Ben, you're fired. Get your things and leave. My property, now. Sir, I was just trying to protect you, Ben protested, panic clear in his voice. People are saying terrible things. They're saying you have an inappropriate interest in the girl. The accusation hit Edward like a punch to the gut. How dare you repeat that filth? I'm not making it up, sir. It's what's going around. Roberta from the kitchen, the security guys, they think you've lost your mind. Edward felt a cold anger creep up his spine. His entire life he had built an impeccable reputation on integrity and professionalism. The idea that his own staff was spreading sordid rumors about his relationship with Sophia was nauseating. Get out, Edward said, his voice as sharp as ice, and take your filthy mind with you. Ben scurried away, but Edward knew the damage was done. If his staff was thinking this way, how many other people were? Society always looked with suspicion on single men who involved themselves with children, especially children from different social classes. That afternoon, Roberta, the cook, requested a private word. She was a sturdy, direct woman in her 50s, who had worked at the mansion for a decade. Mr. Sterling, she began, her nervous hands fiddling with her apron. I have great respect for you, sir, but I need to talk about this situation with the girl. Not you too, Roberta, Edward sighed, feeling a profound weariness. Sir, I've seen how Sophia looks at you. She's getting too attached. And you're changing too. Roberta hesitated. You've always been a controlled man, focused on business. Now you're playing with a child, buying her expensive gifts. Edward frowned. Expensive gifts. The doll Mrs. Albright said you bought. The new dresses, the brand name shoes. Sir, this isn't normal. The girl will get used to luxury, and then how will she go back to her own life? Edward realized there was a misunderstanding, but he also understood the concern behind Roberta's words. He had indeed started buying things for Sophia, not for manipulation, but because seeing her happy sparked a joy in him he hadn't felt in years. Roberta, he said calmly, Sophia is not a passing whim. She and her mother will stay here for as long as they need. But sir, what will people think? You have a reputation to protect. What if someone calls Child Protective Services? What if they start investigating? The mention of Child Protective Services made Edward's blood run cold. He hadn't considered that possibility. Sophia was living with him without any official documentation, without legal authorization. If someone reported the situation, she could be removed from the mansion and placed in a shelter. Sir, Roberta continued, seeing she had hit a nerve, I'm not saying you have bad intentions, but the optics. A wealthy, single man raising a poor girl without her mother around, it raises suspicion. Edward sat down heavily in his armchair. Roberta was right about the appearances, but she was completely wrong about his feelings. Sophia had awakened a paternal instinct in him he didn't know he possessed. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to want to protect someone unconditionally. "What do you suggest I do?" Edward asked, hating himself for needing this conversation. "Perhaps it would be best to find a suitable family to care for the girl while her mother recovers," Roberta said softly. "A family with other children where she might feel more appropriate." Appropriate? Edward felt the anger return. Sophia is perfectly appropriate here. "Sir, please think about it. You want what's best for her, I know. But maybe what's best isn't staying in a mansion with a man she barely knows." Edward looked out the window, seeing Sophia playing in the garden with the doll Mrs. Albright had found. She looked happy, healthier, safer than when she had arrived. The idea of sending her away to protect his own reputation filled him with disgust. "Roberta," he said finally, "I appreciate your concern, but Sophia stays." Roberta sighed, shaking her head. "I hope you don't regret this decision, Mr. Sterling. Sometimes doing the right thing and doing the smart thing are two different things." When she left, Edward was alone, with his thoughts and a terrible premonition that things were about to get much more complicated. Edward was reviewing contracts in his study when he heard the doorbell ring insistently. It was a sunny Friday, and Sophia was in the library doing exercises he had bought for her, basic literacy and math workbooks that kept her occupied while he worked. The sound of the bell made him lift his head, a strange sense of déjà vu washing over him. Mrs. Albright appeared at the study door, her face pale and worried. "Mr. Sterling, there are 2 people at the door. They say they're from Child Protective Services." Edward felt as if the floor had vanished beneath his feet. Roberta's words echoed in his mind like a self-fulfilling curse. He rose slowly, trying to maintain his composure, but his heart was pounding like a war drum. "Where is Sophia?" he asked. "In the library, sir. She doesn't know anything yet." Edward took a deep breath. "Don't let her know for now. I'll see them." He walked to the front door with measured steps, each one echoing through the mansion like a death sentence. When he opened the door, he found a middle-aged woman in a grey suit and a younger man holding a clipboard. Both had professional yet stern expressions. "Mr. Edward Sterling?" the woman asked, showing an ID. "I'm Ms. Evelyn Reed, a social worker with Child Protective Services, and this is my colleague, Mr. David Chen. We've received a report concerning a minor in an irregular situation at this residence." "A report?" Edward tried to keep his voice steady, but he could feel sweat beading on his forehead. "Yes," Mr. Chen said, consulting his clipboard. "Sophia Garcia, age 6. According to the report, she's residing here without the presence of her mother and without proper legal authorization." Edward felt a dull rage rise in his chest. Someone from his own household had made this call. Someone he trusted had decided to destroy the only family Sophia knew. "Sophia is under my temporary care while her mother recovers in the hospital," Edward explained, trying to sound calm and rational. "We understand the situation, Mr. Sterling," Ms. Reed said, "but you must realize there are protocols. A child cannot remain in the care of a non-relative without proper judicial authorization." "And what would the correct protocol be?" Edward asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Sophia must be placed in a foster family or an institution until her mother is medically discharged," Mr. Chen explained. "It's for her protection." "Protection?" Edward couldn't contain his outrage. "Sophia is protected here. She has food, shelter, affection." "Mr. Sterling," Ms. Reed interrupted, "we don't question your good intentions, but there are legal issues involved. We must follow procedure." At that moment, Edward heard small footsteps behind him. He turned and saw Sophia standing in the hall, her large eyes wide with fear. She had overheard the conversation. "Mr. Edward," she said, her voice trembling, "are they going to take me away?" Edward's heart shattered at the terror on Sophia's face. It was exactly what she feared most, being abandoned again, discarded by adults who decided she was a problem to be solved. "Sophia, go back to the library," Edward said softly. "We're just talking." But Sophia didn't move. Instead, she ran to Edward and clung to his leg, looking up at the social workers with the same fear as a cornered animal. "Please don't take me," she pleaded, her words coming out in choked sobs. "I promise I'll be good. I won't be any trouble. Please." Miss Reed knelt to Sophia's level, trying to appear gentle. "Hi, Sophia, don't worry, sweetie. We're going to find a very nice family to take care of you until your mommy gets better." "I don't want another family," Sophia cried, squeezing Edward's leg tighter. "I want to stay with Mr. Edward. He promised I could stay." Edward knelt beside Sophia, a physical pain in his chest at her desperation. "Sophia, remember what we talked about trust. I'm not going to let anything bad happen to you." "Mr. Sterling," Mr. Chen said, "we understand this is an emotional situation, but we must follow the law. The child cannot stay here without proper documentation." "And what would be required for her to stay?" Edward asked, an idea beginning to form in his mind. "A court order for temporary guardianship," Ms. Reed explained, "but that requires a complex legal process, psychological evaluations, background checks." "How long would that process take?" "Several weeks, maybe months, and even then, there's no guarantee of approval." Edward looked at Sophia, who was staring at him with tear-filled eyes and desperate trust. In that moment, he made the most important decision of his life. "Then I'll go to court right now," he said, standing up with Sophia still clinging to him. "I'll hire the best lawyers in the country. I will move heaven and earth to ensure Sophia stays where she wants to stay." "Mr. Sterling," Ms. Reed said, "in the meantime, Sophia needs to come with us. That's the protocol." "No," Edward said, his voice filled with a determination that surprised even himself. "Sophia is not going anywhere until I have exhausted every legal possibility." Mr. Chen frowned. "Sir, are you refusing to cooperate with an order from Child Protective Services?" Edward looked at the two social workers, then at Sophia, who looked to him as if he were her only salvation in the world. And in that moment, he realized it wasn't just Sophia who was being saved. He was being saved too, from an empty, purposeless, loveless life. "I am refusing to turn over a child who is happy and safe to a system that doesn't know her story," Edward said. "And if that means a legal battle, so be it." Ms. Reed sighed. "Mr. Sterling, this could have serious consequences for you." Edward smiled for the first time since the social workers had arrived. "Ms. Reed, for Sophia's sake, I'm willing to face any consequence." When the social workers left, promising to return with a court order, Edward knew his life had changed forever. A war had begun, and he would fight with all his might for the first real family he had ever found. Marcus Thorne's law firm occupied 2 entire floors of the most modern building in the financial district. Edward had worked with Marcus on dozens of corporate acquisitions over the years, but he had never needed his services for something so personal and urgent. Sitting in the conference room, with Sophia beside him nervously drawing on a legal pad, Edward felt the weight of a responsibility that went far beyond business. "Edward," Marcus said, closing a thick folder of legal documents, "I have to be honest with you. Non-relative temporary guardianship cases are extremely complex. The system is designed to protect children, but sometimes that protection can be overly rigid." Sophia looked up from her drawing, a portrait of the family they had become, her, Edward and Carmen, all smiling under a bright yellow sun. "Mr. Edward, what does temporary guardianship mean?" Edward knelt beside Sophia's chair, choosing his words carefully. "It means I want to be officially responsible for taking care of you until your mum is completely better." "What, if they say no?" Sophia asked, her small voice filled with fear. "Then we'll keep fighting until they say yes," Edward replied, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. Marcus cleared his throat. "Edward, there are a few issues we need to address. First, you're single with no prior experience with children. Second, Sophia is from a very different social class, which raises questions of cultural suitability. Third, there are rumors circulating about your motives." Edward felt anger rise in his chest. "What kind of rumors?" "Nothing we can easily prove or disprove, but the opposition will use whatever they can. They'll question why a 52-year-old single millionaire suddenly wants to care for a 6-year-old girl." Sophia stopped drawing and looked at Edward with worried eyes. "Mr. Edward, do people not like me?" Edward's heart broke. "Sophia, people don't know you. If they did, it would be impossible not to like you," Marcus continued, consulting his notes. "We need witnesses who can attest that Sophia is well cared for and happy here. We also need her mother's approval, which could be tricky." "Why would it be tricky?" Edward asked. "Because Carmen might feel pressured to agree out of gratitude or fear of losing her job. The judge will want to be certain her decision is genuine." Edward thought of Carmen, of her dignity even in sickness, of her wounded pride when he had offered help. Carmen is a woman of character. If she says she trusts me with Sophia, it's because she does. "We hope the judge sees it that way," Marcus murmured. "We also need psychological evaluations for you and Sophia, a home inspection, criminal background checks." "How long will this take?" Edward asked, thinking of the social worker's threat to return with a court order. "If we race against the clock, maybe 2 weeks. But Edward, I need you to understand, there is a real possibility we could lose this case." Sophia dropped her pencil and turned to Edward. "If we lose, will I go to an orphanage?" Edward pulled her onto his lap, feeling the smallness and fragility of this body that carried so much courage. "Sophia, do you remember the story we read last night about the knight who fought the dragon?" Sophia nodded. "He didn't give up even when everyone said it was impossible." "Exactly. And do you know why he didn't give up?" "Because he loved the princess," Sophia answered. Edward felt his eyes well up with tears. "Because he loved the princess, and I'm not giving up on you, Sophia. Ever." Marcus watched the interaction with a thoughtful expression. "Edward, can I ask a personal question? Why is this so important to you?" Edward looked at Sophia, then at the drawing she had made. On the paper, the three of them were holding hands, surrounded by flowers and butterflies. It was a vision of a family he never knew he wanted until he found it. "Marcus, I've spent 52 years building a business empire, accumulating wealth, earning respect, but I never knew what it felt like for my life to truly matter to someone." He looked at Sophia, who was listening intently. "Sophia taught me that there's something more valuable than all the money in the world. She taught me what unconditional love is." Sophia smiled and kissed Edward's cheek. "I love you too, Mr. Edward." Marcus stood up, a new determination in his eyes. "All right, we fight. I'll mobilize the entire team. We'll work day and night if we have to." As they left the law firm, Edward felt like a general heading into war, but this time he wasn't fighting for profits or corporate territory. He was fighting for something infinitely more precious, the right to protect and love a child who had transformed his life. "Mr. Edward," Sophia said as they walked to the car, If we win, will you be my real dad? Edward stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, the impact of her words striking him like lightning. Dad. He had never thought of it that way, but it was exactly what he was becoming. Sophia, he said, kneeling on the busy sidewalk, if we win, I will be whatever you need me to be. Sophia hugged him tightly, and Edward knew that regardless of the legal battle's outcome, she had already won his heart forever. The phone rang at 4 a.m, cutting through the mansions. Silence, like an emergency siren. Edward woke instantly, his heart racing before he even answered. Calls at that hour never brought good news. Mr. Sterling? The voice of Dr. Miller, the physician in charge of Carmen's care, was tense. You need to come to the hospital. Immediately. Mrs. Garcia's condition has deteriorated drastically overnight. Edward felt the world tilt around him. What happened? Pneumonia. Her immune system was severely weakened by the tuberculosis. She's in the ICU now, in critical condition. Edward hung up with trembling hands. Carmen could die. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, not just for the brave woman he had grown to respect, but for what her death would mean for Sophia. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that she might lose the only family she had ever known? He went silently up the stairs to Sophia's room. She was sleeping peacefully, clutching the cloth doll, her hair spread across the pillow like a dark halo. Edward watched her for a moment, wondering how to shield her from this new pain. Sophia, he whispered, gently touching her shoulder. Wake up, sweetheart. Sophia's eyes fluttered open, still sleepy. Mr. Edward, what time is it? It's early, but we need to go see your mom. She's not feeling very well. Sophia sat, up instantly, all sleepiness gone. Is she worse? Edward hesitated. Sophia deserved the truth. But how could he deliver such devastating news to a child? She is a little sicker, yes, but the doctors are taking good care of her. Sophia studied him with those large, perceptive eyes that seemed to see right through his soul. Mr. Edward, are you lying to protect me? The question startled him. Sophia had developed an uncanny intuition for the emotions of the adults around her. I'm not lying, Sophia, but I am worried. Could she die? The question came out in a whisper, as if Sophia feared that saying it aloud could make it real. Edward sat on the bed and pulled Sophia into his arms. I don't know, sweetheart, but I know your mom is very strong and she's fighting to come back to you. Sophia began to cry silently, tears rolling down her face without a single sob. It was a grief too mature for a child, an understanding of mortality she shouldn't have to face. If she dies, will I be all alone again? Sophia asked. Edward felt something break in his chest. Sophia, listen to me very carefully. You will never, ever be alone again. I promise you that. But what if the people from CPS take me away when they find out Mommy died? Edward realized that Sophia had perfectly understood the complexity of her situation. Without Carmen, the legal battle for guardianship would become even more complicated. A child orphaned of both parents would automatically be routed toward adoption or the foster system. Sophia, he said, looking directly into her eyes, if anything happens to your mother, I will officially adopt you. You will be my real daughter, forever. The words came out before he could think them through, but the moment he said them, Edward knew they were absolutely true. Sophia had become his daughter in his heart long before any legal document could make it so. Sophia stopped crying and looked at him with a mixture of hope and disbelief. For real? You would be my dad? For real, Edward confirmed. Do you want that? Sophia hugged him with enough force to take his breath away. I've always wanted a dad who really loved me. At the hospital, They found Carmen unconscious, surrounded by tubes and monitors that beeped relentlessly. Her breathing was labored, assisted by machines, and her skin had a grayish pallor that alarmed Edward. Sophia approached the bed with hesitant steps. "Mommy," she whispered, "it's Sophia. I came to see you." Dr. Miller pulled Edward to a corner of the room. "Mr. Sterling, I need to be blunt. The situation is dire. Carmen needs to be transferred to a private hospital with a more advanced ICU if we want to maximize her chances." "Make the transfer immediately," Edward said without hesitation. "There's a problem. Her health insurance doesn't cover this level of treatment, and the private hospital requires a $50,000 deposit before they'll accept the transfer." Edward didn't even blink. "That's not a problem. I'll wire the money right now." Dr. Miller looked relieved. "Sir, there's one more thing. Carmen doesn't have adequate documentation for advanced medical procedures. She always avoided hospitals due to her financial situation, so there are gaps in her medical history." Edward frowned. "What kind of documentation?" "A complete medical history, prior test results, updated identity documents. For expensive treatments, private hospitals are very strict about paperwork." Edward realized that Carmen's poverty had created a bureaucratic barrier that could cost her her life. People like her lived on the margins of the system, invisible, until they needed help they couldn't afford. "Doctor," Edward said, "I will handle all of these issues. I want Carmen to have the best treatment available, regardless of cost or bureaucracy." When they returned to the room, Sophia was holding Carmen's hand, whispering stories about her life in the mansion. "Mommy, Mr. Edward taught me how to play chess, and there's a giant library with books about princesses." Edward watched as Sophia tried to rouse her mother with stories of happiness, and he realized that this child was facing the possibility of losing everything with a courage he could barely comprehend. "Sophia," he said softly, "your mother can hear you. Keep telling her stories." And as Sophia spoke of gardens full of flowers and rooms with enormous windows, Edward made a silent promise. Regardless of what happened to Carmen, Sophia would never know abandonment again. While Carmen fought for her life in the ICU of the private hospital, Edward discovered a side of Sophia that left him utterly impressed. During the third week of agonizing waiting, he found the girl in the mansion's library, not just reading, but making complex notes in a notebook. "Sophia, what are you doing?" Edward asked, sitting beside her in the leather armchair. "I'm calculating how much it costs to take care of Mommy," she answered seriously, showing him pages filled with numbers organized into columns. "You've spent a lot of money on her, haven't you?" Edward examined the notebook with growing astonishment. Sophia had meticulously listed every expense she had managed to observe: the cost of the private ambulance, the expensive medications, the daily ICU charges. More impressively, she had made surprisingly accurate estimates of the costs. "Sophia, how did you learn to do this kind of math?" "Mommy taught me to add and subtract when I was little," Sophia explained. "She said I needed to know how to handle money because it's just the two of us. Then I learned more on my own, looking at newspapers and magazines people threw away." Edward turned the pages of the notebook, discovering math exercises Sophia had created for herself. She was solving multiplication and division problems normally. Taught to 10 or 11-year-olds, "Sophia, have you ever been to school?" "Mommy tried to enroll me last year, but the public school near our house was full. They said I had to wait for an opening." Sophia bit her lip. "Mommy was very sad because she didn't have money for a private school." Edward felt a mixture of admiration and indignation. Sophia was clearly a gifted child, with an extraordinary intelligence that was being wasted due to a lack of opportunity. How many other children like her were out there, lost in a system that failed to recognize their potential? "Would you like to go to a real school?" Edward asked. Sophia's eyes lit up. "Very much. Mommy always said that education is the only way to have a better life," but her expression fell. "School is for kids who have normal families." "Sophia, you have a normal family. You have your mother, and now you have me." Sophia looked at him with that intensity that always surprised him. "Mr. Edward, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why don't you have a family? A good man like you should have a wife and kids." The question struck Edward like an arrow. How could he explain to a 6-year-old that he had spent his entire life running from emotional commitments, building walls around his heart? "I always thought I didn't need a family," Edward said honestly. "I thought my work was enough." "And now?" Edward smiled, touching Sophia's face. "Now I know I was wrong. Family is the most important thing in the world." Sophia turned her attention back to the notebook. "Mr. Edward, I calculated that you've already spent over $100,000 on Mummy. How are we going to pay you back?" Edward was shocked by the accuracy of her calculation. Sophia had managed to estimate the medical costs with stunning precision. "Sophia, you don't need to worry about that. Money is meant to be used when the people we love need it." "But it's so much money," Sophia insisted. "Mommy always said we shouldn't accept things we can't pay back." Edward realized he was facing a delicate dilemma. Carmen had raised Sophia with a sense of dignity and independence that was admirable, but it also made her feel guilty for accepting help. "Sophia, do you know what an investment is?" Sophia shook her head. "It's when you spend money hoping for something good to happen in the future. I'm not spending money on your mother expecting you to pay me back. I'm investing in our family." Sophia frowned, thinking, "How so?" "Your mother is going to get well and continue to thrive. You're going to go to school and become a very smart and successful person, and I get to have a family that loves me. That's the best investment I've ever made in my life." Sophia smiled but still looked worried. "What if I can't be smart enough? What if I disappoint you?" Edward pulled Sophia onto his lap, feeling the weight of his responsibility. This extraordinary child was so used to rejection that she couldn't believe someone valued her unconditionally. "Sophia, you are already the smartest and bravest person I know. At 6 years old, you took care of yourself for 2 weeks, tried to protect your mother's job, and now you're calculating complex medical bills. You could never disappoint me." "Promise?" "I promise. And you know what else I promise? I'm going to enroll you in the best school in the city. You'll have teachers who recognize your intelligence, as many books as you want, and every opportunity you deserve." Sophia hugged him tightly. "Thank you for believing in me, Mr. Edward." That night, Edward called Marcus, his lawyer. "Marcus, in addition to the temporary guardianship, I want to prepare the paperwork for official adoption, and I want to establish an educational trust for Sophia." "Edward, are you sure? Adoption is a permanent commitment." "I am absolutely sure," Edward interrupted. "Sophia isn't just a child I'm helping. She's my daughter." When he hung up the phone, Edward looked out his study window and saw Sophia in the garden, reading a book under the glow of a lamppost. She had found a way to keep learning even in the dark, driven by a thirst for knowledge that was impossible to ignore. Edward smiled, realizing he wasn't just saving Sophia. She was saving him, showing him that true success wasn't measured in money or power, but in the ability to nurture and protect those we love. In the 4th week since Sophia's arrival at the mansion, Carmen finally woke from the deep sedation that had kept her unconscious for 10 days. Edward received the Call from Dr. Miller in the middle of a meeting with the psychologist who was evaluating his fitness for Sophia's guardianship. He apologized abruptly and rushed to the hospital, taking Sophia with him. When they entered the ICU room, Carmen was sitting up in bed, still fragile and connected to a few tubes, but her eyes were alert and focused. Her face lit up when she saw Sophia, but when her eyes moved to Edward, her expression shifted to something more complex, gratitude mixed with a kind of proud shame. "Mommy!" Sophia ran to the bed but stopped short of hugging her, careful of the medical equipment. "My love," Carmen whispered, her voice still hoarse. "Are you okay? Are you taking good care of yourself?" Sophia nodded vigorously. "Mr. Edward is taking care of me. He's very good, Mommy. He gave me books, taught me to play chess, and..." She trailed off, noticing the tension on her mother's face. Carmen looked at Edward over Sophia's head. "Mr. Sterling, I don't know how to thank you for what you've done for us. The doctors told me about the private hospital, about all the expenses." "Carmen," Edward interrupted gently, "you don't have to thank me. I'm just glad you're better." "But I do," Carmen said, trying to sit up straighter. "You saved my life, and you took care of Sophia when I couldn't." Her voice broke, and tears began to roll down her face. "I failed as a mother. I left my daughter alone, unprotected." Sophia carefully climbed onto the bed and nestled beside her mother. "Mommy, you didn't fail. You got sick, but that's not your fault." Edward pulled a chair closer to the bed. During the weeks of vigil, he had thought a great deal about this conversation, knowing it would be one of the most important moments of their lives. "Carmen," he said, "I need to talk to you about Sophia." Carmen tensed, her maternal instinct on high alert for some danger. "What happened? Did she do something wrong?" "On the contrary," Edward smiled, "Sophia is extraordinary, but there have been some legal complications." Edward told her about the visit from CPS, about the legal battle for temporary guardianship, about the malicious rumors spread by his staff. With every word, Carmen's face grew paler. "Mr. Sterling," she said when he finished, "you don't have to do this. I understand the situation has become complicated. When I'm discharged, I'll take Sophia and leave. We don't want to cause any more trouble." The response hit Edward like a slap in the face. Even after everything they had been through together, Carmen still saw herself as an intruder, an employee who had overstepped her bounds. "Carmen," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you don't understand. I don't want Sophia to leave. I want to officially adopt her." The silence that followed was deafening. Carmen stared at Edward as if he had spoken in a foreign language. "Adopt?" she repeated, her voice weak. "Mommy," Sophia said, her eyes shining with excitement, "Mr. Edward wants to be my real dad." Carmen turned to her daughter, then back to Edward. "Sir, you can't be serious. Sophia is... We're simple people. You're an important, wealthy man. Why would you want..." "Because Sophia changed my life," Edward interrupted. "Because she taught me what unconditional love is. Because when I look at her, I see the daughter I never knew I wanted." Carmen began to cry again, but now they were tears of a deeper pain. "Mr. Sterling, I appreciate your kindness, but I can't accept this." Edward felt his heart sink. "Why?" "Because it wouldn't be fair to Sophia," Carmen said, her voice gaining strength. "You're single, with no experience with children. Sophia deserves a real family with a mother and a father with kids her own age." "Carmen," Edward said firmly, "look at your daughter. Is she happy?" Carmen looked at Sophia, who was watching her with a mixture of hope and fear. "She is, but is she healthy, well cared for, loved?" "Yes, but..." "Then why would you refuse a chance to give her everything you've always wanted for her?" Education, opportunities, security. Carmen closed her eyes, fighting a devastating internal battle. Because I'm afraid it's charity. I'm afraid one day you'll get tired of us and send us away. I'm afraid Sophia will get used to a life that isn't rightfully hers. Edward realized he was facing the third major turning point. Carmen wasn't rejecting his proposal out of ingratitude, but out of a wounded pride and a deep-seated fear of building expectations that could be shattered. "Carmen," he said, standing and kneeling beside the bed, "look me in the eye. This is not charity. Sophia is not a charity project. She is my daughter in my heart, and you are the brave woman who raised her. You are my family." "What if you change your mind?" Carmen whispered. "What if I die tomorrow?" Edward countered. "What if a meteor hits the earth?" "Carmen, we can't live in fear of what might happen. We can only live with love for what we have right now." Sophia looked at her mother with her large, wise eyes. "Mommy, Mr. Edward promised he would never abandon me, and I believe him." Carmen looked at her daughter, then at Edward, then back to Sophia. "You really want this, my love?" "Very much," Sophia replied. "I want to be his real daughter, and I want you to be happy too." Carmen closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, she had made a decision that would change all of their lives forever. "Mr. Sterling," she said, "if you promise that you will love Sophia as if she were your own flesh and blood." "I promise," Edward said without hesitation. "Then I accept your proposal." Sophia cried out with joy and hugged both her mother and Edward simultaneously, and in that moment, in a hospital ICU, an unlikely family was finally complete. The hearing for temporary guardianship was scheduled for a rainy Friday, exactly 5 weeks after the afternoon that had changed everything. Edward wore his best suit, but his hands trembled as he adjusted his tie. Sophia stood beside him, wearing a blue dress Mrs. Albright had bought especially for the occasion, her hair in 2 neat braids. "Mr. Edward," Sophia said as they walked through the courthouse corridors, "if the judge says no, are you going to give up on me?" Edward stopped and knelt before her, ignoring the curious glances of passers-by. "Sophia, listen to me. No matter what happens today, I will never give up on you. If we lose, we will appeal. If we appeal and lose, we will try again. I will fight for you until my last day on this earth." Sophia smiled, but Edward could see the fear in her eyes. Over the past weeks, they had become inseparable. Sophia accompanied him to meetings with lawyers, sat quietly during conference calls, and drew while he worked in his study. They had developed a father-daughter routine that was both natural and precious. The courtroom was intimidating, with its dark wood paneling and solemn air that made even whispers echo. Edward sat with Marcus at the petitioner's table, while Sophia remained in the gallery with Carmen, who had been discharged from the hospital 2 days prior, still frail but determined to be there. Judge Henry Monroe entered, a man in his 60s with graying hair and a serious expression that betrayed nothing. Edward had researched him. He was known for being thorough but fair, especially in cases involving children. "Mr. Edward Sterling," the judge began, consulting a thick file, "you are petitioning for temporary guardianship of the minor. Sophia Garcia, age 6, daughter of Carmen Garcia, your employee, is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Edward replied, his voice firm despite his nerves. "Mr. Thorne," the judge addressed Marcus, "present your client's case." Marcus stood, organizing his papers. For the next hour, he meticulously presented Edward's case, the impeccable psychological evaluations, recommendations from child development experts, and witness testimonies about Sophia's well-being in the mansion. Then it was the prosecutor's turn. ADA Beatrice Ross, a woman in her 40s representing the state's interest in protecting Sophia. "Your Honor," she began, "while we acknowledge Mr. Sterling's good intentions, we have concerns about this guardianship. First, the petitioner is single, with no prior experience with children. Second, there is a significant socio-economic disparity between the parties that could create a harmful dependency. Third, we have received anonymous reports questioning the petitioner's motives." Edward felt anger rise in his chest at the mention of anonymous reports, knowing they came from the staff he had fired. Furthermore, the prosecutor continued, "We have specialized foster families who would be better suited to care for the minor while her mother fully recovers." The judge turned to Edward. "Mr. Sterling, why do you believe it would be better for Sophia to remain in your care rather than be placed with a foster family?" Edward stood, feeling the full weight of his responsibility. Everything that had happened in the last 5 weeks hinged on his answer. "Your Honor," he began, "5 weeks ago I was a completely different man. I lived isolated in my mansion, focused only on business, without understanding what unconditional love meant. When Sophia knocked on my door that rainy afternoon, she wasn't just asking for help, she was offering me a chance at redemption." Edward looked at Sophia, who watched him with tear-filled eyes. "Sophia taught me that being a father isn't about experience or preparation. It's about being willing to sacrifice everything for a child's well-being. It's about a love that doesn't depend on reciprocity or expectations." "And the issue of socio-economic disparity?" the judge asked. "Your Honor, Sophia comes from a family of limited resources but limitless values. Her mother raised her with dignity, courage, and compassion. I can offer Sophia educational and material opportunities, but she offers me something far more valuable, the chance to be a father, to have a family, to discover my true purpose in life." Edward took a deep breath. "I know there are specialized families who could technically care for Sophia adequately, but I don't just offer technical care. I offer a home where she is loved unconditionally, where her extraordinary intelligence is recognized and nurtured, where her courage is celebrated every day." The judge turned to Sophia. "Sophia, would you like to speak?" Sophia stood, her little legs barely reaching the floor. "May I, Your Honor?" "Of course, dear." Sophia walked to the front of the courtroom, her clear voice echoing through the silent room. "Your Honor, I know I'm little, but I know what real love feels like. Mr. Edward doesn't love me because he has to. He loves me because he chose to love me." Sophia's words cut through the silence like a blade of pure truth. "I lived with other people before who said they would take care of me, but they sent me away when they learned my mom gets sick. Sometimes Mr. Edward didn't send me away. He fights for me every day." Edward felt tears streaming down his face. Sophia's eloquence and maturity were stunning, but it was the pure sincerity in her words that touched everyone present. "Your Honor," Sophia continued, "I know a girl like me isn't supposed to live in a big mansion, but Mr. Edward made that house a home, and I made him a dad. We don't want to be separated." The judge cleared his throat, clearly moved. "Thank you, Sophia. You may return to your seat." After a pause that seemed to last an eternity, the judge banged his gavel. "Temporary guardianship is granted. Mr. Edward Sterling is authorized to retain custody of Sophia Garcia for the next 6 months, during which time periodic evaluations will be conducted to determine the feasibility of permanent adoption." The room erupted in tears of relief. Sophia ran to Edward, who swept her up into his arms, spinning her in the air as they both cried with happiness. Carmen approached, hugging them both tightly. "Thank you," she whispered to Edward, "for saving my daughter, for saving us." Edward looked at his new family, imperfect, improvised, but utterly perfect in their mutual love. 5 weeks ago, he was a man who had everything and nothing. Now, he finally understood the difference between success and fulfillment. "No," he said to Carmen, "thank you for letting me save you, because in the end, you were the ones who saved me." 6 months after the hearing, Edward was in his study reviewing the latest reforms he had implemented in his company when Marcus arrived with a folder of documents and a smile he couldn't hide. "Edward," he announced, "I have good news. The judge has approved the permanent adoption. Sophia is officially your daughter." Edward closed his eyes, a wave of relief and gratitude washing over him that threatened to knock him over. 6 months of periodic evaluations, visits from social workers, psychological reports, and constant anxiety were finally over. "When can I get the documents?" Edward asked. "They're right here," Marcus said, holding out the folder. "New birth certificate with you as the father. Sophia Garcia Sterling. Has a nice ring to it, doesn't it?" Edward held the documents with trembling hands. Sophia Garcia Sterling, his daughter, officially, legally, forever. "There's one more thing," Marcus continued. "Carmen signed the papers relinquishing her parental rights, but retaining unrestricted visitation. She said she wants Sophia to have the best life possible, even if it means she's no longer the legal guardian." Edward nodded. In the past months, Carmen had settled into a new life. He had promoted her to a general supervisor role in his company, with a salary that lifted her definitively out of poverty. She lived in a comfortable apartment 10 minutes from the mansion and visited Sophia every day after work. "Daddy!" Sophia's voice echoed down the hall before she came running through the study door. In the last few months, she had started in calling him Dad, naturally, and Edward never tired of hearing the word. "Hi, sweetheart," Edward said, opening his arms to welcome her. "How was school today?" Sophia had been enrolled in the city's best private school, where her teachers were astounded by her exceptional intelligence. She had not only adapted quickly to the academic environment, but had also distinguished herself as one of the brightest students in her grade. "It was great. My teacher said I can skip a grade if I want," Sophia said excitedly. "But I told her I'd think about it because I like my friends in my current class." Edward smiled. Sophia had developed an impressive emotional maturity, balancing her academic intelligence with a natural social wisdom. "Sophia," Edward said, "I have a surprise for you." He showed her the adoption papers. Sophia read them carefully, her expression growing more emotional with each word. "Does this mean you're my real dad now?" she asked. "Forever," Edward confirmed. Sophia hugged him tightly. "Thank you for not giving up on me, Daddy." That night, Edward organized a special dinner to celebrate the official adoption. Carmen arrived at 7, carrying a cake she had made for the occasion. Mrs. Albright, who had become a motherly figure to Sophia, prepared the girl's favorite dish. Even Marcus was invited, along with Dr. Miller, the doctor who had saved Carmen's life. During dinner, Edward looked around the table and marveled at the unlikely family they had created. Carmen, the brave woman who had sacrificed everything for her daughter. Sophia, the extraordinary child who had transformed his life. Mrs. Albright, who had embraced the new dynamic of the house with maternal affection. Marcus, who had fought tirelessly for them in court. "I'd like to make a toast," Edward said, standing with a glass of grape juice. Sophia had insisted the whole family drink the same thing. 7 months ago, I was a man who had everything materially, but nothing emotionally. I lived in a mansion that was just an empty house, ran a company that was just numbers on a spreadsheet. Edward looked at Sophia, who was watching him with those large, attentive eyes. Then a brave little girl knocked on my door on a rainy afternoon, and everything changed. She didn't just teach me what it is to be a father, she taught me what it is to be human. Carmen wiped a tear from her cheek. "Mr. Edward." "Carmen," Edward interrupted. "Please call me Edward. We're family now." Carmen smiled. "Edward, thank you for seeing in Sophia what I always knew was there, for giving her opportunities I never could. And thank you for raising such an extraordinary daughter," Edward replied. "Sophia is who she is because of you, Carmen. Her courage, her intelligence, her compassion, all of it comes from the upbringing you gave her." Sophia stood up on her chair. "Can I speak too?" Everyone laughed and nodded. "I want to thank everyone for showing me that family isn't just about who you're born with," Sophia said, her voice clear and firm. "Family is about who chooses to stay together even when it's hard." Edward felt his heart swell with pride. At 7, Sophia had articulated a profound truth about love and commitment. "And I want to especially thank my daddy," Sophia continued, looking at Edward, "for teaching me that I deserve to be loved. And Mommy Carmen for teaching me to be strong." Edward raised his glass. "To our family, imperfect, improvised, but absolutely perfect in its love." "To our family," everyone repeated in unison. Later that night, after Carmen had gone home and Mrs. Albright had retired, Edward was tucking Sophia into bed when she asked a question that surprised him. "Daddy, do you think everything happened for a reason?" Edward thought for a moment. "What do you mean? Mommy getting sick, me having to find you, the CPS people trying to separate us. Do you think all of that had to happen for us to become a family?" Edward sat on the edge of the bed, struck by the depth of Sophia's question. "You know what I think? I think sometimes life breaks us so we can rebuild ourselves stronger and more complete." Sophia nodded thoughtfully. "So we broke to find each other?" Edward kissed Sophia's forehead. "Exactly. And now we're a family that no one can break again." When Sophia fell asleep, Edward watched her for a few minutes, still hardly believing this extraordinary child was his daughter. He had spent 52 years building a business empire, but only now, at 53, had he discovered his true purpose, being Sophia's father. Leaving the room, Edward paused in the hall and looked at the photos that now decorated the walls. Pictures of Sophia at school, of family dinners, of everyday moments that had become precious. The mansion was no longer a mausoleum of empty success. It was a home filled with life, love, and laughter. Edward smiled, knowing that from now on, every day would be a new adventure with his extraordinary daughter by his side. 1 year after that rainy afternoon that changed everything, Edward stood on the same doorstep where he had first found Sophia, but now, instead of rain, a golden late afternoon sun bathed the mansion's garden, where a birthday party was in full swing. Sophia, now 7, ran across the lawn with her school friends, her crystal-clear laughter echoing through the air. She had grown a few inches and gained a healthy weight, but she retained the same fierce determination in her large eyes. The difference was that now that determination shone with confidence and happiness. "Daddy, come play with us," Sophia shouted, waving at Edward with hands smudged with chocolate cake. Edward smiled, loosening his tie. A year ago, he would never have imagined attending a child's party, let alone playing tag in the garden of his own mansion. Now, he couldn't imagine a place he'd rather be. Carmen approached, carrying a tray of snacks for the children. She was unrecognizable from the frail, desperate woman Edward had visited in the hospital a year before. Her face had a healthy glow, her eyes shone with confidence, and she wore a navy blue dress Edward had given her for her last birthday. "Edward," she said, "I'll never be able to thank you enough for everything you've done for us." "Carmen," Edward replied, watching Sophia organize a game for her friends, "I should be thanking you. Sophia taught me that true success isn't measured in business accomplishments, but in the ability to love and be loved unconditionally." Carmen smiled. "She really has changed you, hasn't she? I remember when I first came to work here, you barely looked at the staff. Now," she gestured to the party, "just look at this." Edward looked around. Mrs. Albright was serving sodas to the children, laughing when one of them spilled juice on the grass. Dr. Miller was talking to Marcus about Sophia's academic progress. Even some neighbors had been invited, children and adults mingling in a celebration that would never have happened in the silent mansion of before. "Sophia didn't just change my life," Edward said. "She taught me how to live." At that moment, Sophia ran up to them, her loose hair flying in the wind. "Daddy, Mommy, Carmen, come see." She pulled them to a table where she had arranged all the drawings she had made throughout the year. There were dozens of them, showing the evolution of a family. The first ones showed 3 hesitant figures under a large roof. The most recent one showed the same family in a group hug, smiling, surrounded by flowers and happy animals. "This one," Sophia said, pointing to the latest drawing, "is our family today. Look how happy everyone is." Edward picked up the drawing, observing the careful details. Sophia had included not only Edward, Carmen, and herself, but also Mrs. Albright, Dr. Miller, Marcus, and even a dog she had been asking to adopt. "Sophia," Edward said, kneeling to her level, "do you really want a dog?" Sophia's eyes widened. "Very much, but only if you want one too." Edward glanced at Carmen, who laughed and nodded. "I think our family can grow a little more." Sophia screamed with joy and hugged Edward with enough force to take his breath away. "Thank you, Daddy. You're the best dad in the world." As the sun began to set and the guests departed, Edward, Sophia, and Carmen sat on the garden swing Edward had installed. Sophia was between the 2 adults, her head resting on Edward's shoulder, her little legs swinging freely. "Daddy," Sophia said sleepily, "do you remember what it was like before I came here?" Edward thought of the silent mansion, the lonely dinners, the empty nights filled only with work. "I remember, sweetheart. Why?" "Because I can hardly remember what it was like before I had you as a dad," Sophia said. "It's like my whole life before was just waiting to get here." Carmen stroked her daughter's hair. "And I can hardly remember what it was like to be afraid of the future." Edward looked at the 2 women who had transformed his existence. Carmen had become not just a valued colleague, but a dear friend and a co-parent to Sophia. She had found her dignity and independence, but had also learned to accept love and support when needed. "Do you know what I've discovered this year?" Edward said. "I've discovered that true wealth isn't in material possessions, but in the courage to open our hearts to those who need our protection most." Sophia sat up straight. "And I discovered that sometimes the best parents are the ones who choose to be parents, not just the ones who are born parents." Carmen smiled. "And I discovered that accepting help isn't a sign of weakness, but of wisdom." As the first star appeared in the sky, Sophia made a silent wish. Edward watched her, thinking how this extraordinary child had come into his life. Like an angel disguised as a frightened girl in a wet smock. "What did you wish for?" Edward asked. "For our family to be happy forever," Sophia replied, "and for other little boys and girls who need help to find good people like you." Edward felt tears well up in his eyes. Sophia, even having found her own safety, still thought of other children who might be going through what she had. "You know what we're going to do?" Edward said, an idea forming in his mind. "We're going to create a foundation to help children in situations like yours. We're going to make sure other families don't go through what you 2 went through." Sophia brightened. "Can I help?" "Of course. It will be our family mission." As they entered the mansion that night, Edward paused in the foyer and looked around. The walls that once displayed only business trophies were now filled with family photos, Sophia's drawings, and mementos of happy moments. The marble staircase had become a place where Sophia played hide and seek. The library had been transformed into a study center where father and daughter did homework together every night. The mansion, once a symbol of isolation and power, now represented sanctuary and proof that when we open our doors to love, we discover that we were the ones who most needed to be saved. On the entryway wall, framed in fine oak, was the first drawing Sophia had made in the mansion. 3 figures, holding hands under a large roof with a bright yellow sun above. Beneath it, Edward had a plaque engraved, "The day our family began." As Sophia slept in his arms, Edward carried her to her room, thinking how surprising life could be. He had spent 52 years believing he needed absolute control to be happy. Sophia had taught him that true happiness came from surrender, from the ability to give oneself completely to the love of another. Placing Sophia in bed and kissing her forehead, Edward whispered, "Thank you for saving me, my daughter." And, as night embraced the mansion, an improvised and perfect family slept in peace, knowing they had found not only each other, but also their true purposes in life, to protect, love, and care for those who need it most. The smock Sophia wore on that first day now hung framed on Edward's office wall, a reminder that the most unlikely encounters can lead to the most profound transformations, and that sometimes a brave child can teach a powerful adult the most important lessons about love, family, and redemption.